All right. Yesterday, in our intensive, we worked with a couple poems. Rilke poem, "Living the Questions," great poem, and I started with a bit of a tribute to 9/11 with a poem I wrote 10 years ago called Ground Zero. Wrote it at the monastery 10 years after 9/11. Well, here we are 20 years after this event. There was a lot of 9/11s in the world besides this one. Ron will know about two tragic ones in Haiti, the bombing of Aristide's church in the poor section on 9/11. It's during Duvalier times, and then in post-Aristide times, after the first coup, a great friend of Ron's was grabbed by death squads right in the church and pulled out to the street and shot in the head. Ron was right there, and so there are other 9/11s. It seems to be a kind of a day. Salvador Allende was overthrown by a military coup in Chile. Chileans remember 9/11 as well. And then the military junta was put in after that. So those are three. There's more, of course. There's one in our revolutionary times or post-revolutionary times having to do with the slave rebellion on 9/11. But essentially, 9/11 is whenever everything falls apart. And so I think in everybody's lives, there's a few 9/11s, maybe necessary 9/11s, when things totally collapse and you have to start again. So I want to use a couple of poems. One that I wrote the day after 9/11, and then one that I wrote a few years later, or excuse me, a few months later in March when we began bombing Iraq with what was, those of you around there remember, shock and awe. But I wrote this poem. It was based on walking into the faculty room the day after 9/11, and a dear friend of mine, a person who has as good a heart as anybody that I know, we started talking. And it starts the poem with her. She says, "I don't like war," you said, "but I feel we have to do something." But why? Isn't that just our deepest American addiction? Life happens, and we feel compelled to react, to do something right now. What if we followed the crazy wisdom of Zen? Don't just do something, sit there. What if we just sat on the ashes at ground zero and wept and wept until we could weep no more? Perhaps that mighty river of grief would cleanse our eyes or give us brand new eyes and the vision that America and the world so desperately needs. So please, don't just do something, sit there till the ashes have grown cold, until your tender heart of hearts catches fire. So please, don't just do something, sit there till the ashes have grown cold and your tender heart of hearts catches fire. It's just called sit there. And that was the feeling of those of us who are old enough to remember those times. We were going to rush off to war before we'd even grieved. I'm not sure we've grieved it yet. One part of this was influenced, you know, uh, what if we just sat on the ashes at ground zero and wept until we could weep no more? That sentiment was given. There was a retreat that I had signed up for, and several of my Tennessee pals had signed up for. That was the next week after 9/11, and we'd signed up for it well in advance. It was for a retreat that was called Benedict's Dharma. Saint Benedict wrote the Benedictine Rule, which was a foundation for many monastic communities, 6th century. And for a year, a bunch of Buddhists from all over the world signed on to study the rule and meditate on it. And then they were going to come, they came together in Indianapolis at Beach Grove, a Benedictine monastery for women. And so we signed up to do it. And well, we talked on the phone, well, are we going? They said, well, yeah, they're still having it. So we went. And actually, not only did everybody show up who signed up, but a lot of extra people showed up to just talk, to hear Buddhists and Christians talk about a rule for life. The interesting thing about the Benedictine monastery and the rule of St. Benedict, when Rome was just in chaos, law and order had been lost. They had their own 9/11 with all the invasions of the tribes from the east. And so Benedict just, he built his own little city there, and they had their own rule because there was no rules out there. And that was the start of European Christian monasticism just outside of Rome. So he felt the destruction of the empire and law, order, and all that. He felt like, well, all right, that all collapsed. Well, we'll start something new. And that was the start of Benedictine monasticism and the rule. Well, the interesting thing, I could talk for the morning on what I got out of that retreat, including a hug from Brother David Stendelras, which I'll never forget. But there was a Chinese monk, a woman monk, and she was from a Chinese monastery in Taiwan. And she had been doing the reading, and she was all set to come. And then 9/11 happened, and you couldn't, air transport into the United States was, shut down for a good while, if you remember. And so she told her abbess she still wanted to go, and her abbess said, "Oh, it's too dangerous. We can't go. You can't fly." And she says, "Well, what does it mean to be a Buddhist if you don't go where the suffering is?" And so she flew to Australia. And for Australia, she flew to Vancouver. And from Vancouver, she took a bus to Indianapolis, and she made it. And she was an impressive woman. She was like 4'0" 4'8" probably, bald head, saffron robe. She was a lawyer before she became a monk. I guess she tried the law and decided that she wanted something more meaningful for her. And but the one thing I remember, she had an open ticket, and she was talked very movingly. Everybody was referencing, the smoke was still in the air from 9/11 at that time. And so she said, "I've got an open ticket. I'm going to find my way to New York, and I'm going to get as close as I can get to ground zero. And I'm just going to put down my meditation mat, and I'm going to sit there and weep for the suffering people until I have no more tears. And then I'll just find a way to help people any way I can." She didn't know where she was going to stay. She didn't know how long she was going to stay, but she certainly was going to do the first thing. She was get as close as she could to the place, and then weep until she had no more tears, to really grieve it. And then she'd help anybody that she could in any way she could. I don't know what her name was, Ifa, and I don't know how long she stayed, and maybe she's still there helping. I don't know, but that was the Buddhist spirit. But before you try to do something, sit, connect, and in this case, grieve. That was quite so there's the crazy wisdom of Zen. We talked quite a bit. We talked about two flavors of Zen yesterday and some different ways to meditate with, especially when you have colossal existential situations or problems. But the idea of to grieve these losses before you're going to jump into taking some, that's a response. It's a response of the heart rather than just reacting by doing something. Yeah, I wish we had done that. I'm dedicating this session to Congressman Barbara Lee from California, just in admiration for her, because in those days following 9/11, Congress passed a thing that was, you might not know the acronym, AUMF. It was the authorization for the use of military force, which gave the president basically carte blanche for doing whatever he wanted anywhere. Still in existence 20 years later, 98-0. Two senators abstained from voting, but they voted thumbs up to do that. In 480-1, the one was Barbara Lee. And she stood up there and gave quite a moving talk during the 5 hours of debate about why, when it came right down to it, she thought it would lead to endless war. And she had several death threats, was beat up on by both the Democrats and the Republican, but she also got 40,000 thumbs up from people, including calls from Coretta Scott King and Bishop Tutu, which she prized those two, but still it was a bold move. Proved to be the one person that in our representatives that had the insight to know. And she mentioned it. I fear if we pass this, it's going to lead to endless wars. Well, and if you want to go to Brown University's cost of war site, they took it on from the very beginning to just keep track of what the cost was in terms of lives. There are probably about 800,000 lives now lost. This blank check given to the president has been used by all the presidents since to engage in 41 different countries with military operations. The main ones, of course, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, but Libya. It's all under that same thing that the president can just decide to shoot off some missiles if he wants. And we got to get a handle on that. So I dedicate to her. Yesterday when we got into our sort of Quaker communion session at the end, we heard really movingly from somebody who's here today. I hope I don't embarrass you, but Tom Troutman from Rochester, Indiana, and he talked about his struggle with and having to stand up for and change a lot of his beliefs based on the war. And I just so admired that, Tom. And we let these things change us. Okay. Well, here's a poem I wrote. It was 5 months later in March, when after we bombed quite a bit of Afghanistan, and then we decided to attack Iraq. This was written in that time. Go gently into the streets to protest the war. Go gently into discussions with your neighbor about the price of oil and human life. Go gently into your own kitchens and living rooms, into your schools and workplaces. Go gently into your houses of worship, into your hospitals and prisons. Go gently into your opinions of world leaders. And go gently, ever so gently, into your own mind. Otherwise, what have you really accomplished? If you go with aggression, you may win the battle, but you won't stop the war. For aggression is war. If you go with aggression, you may win the battle, but you won't stop the war. For aggression is war. All wars are lost as soon as they've begun. So go gently into the very thick and heat of battle. Go gently. And even if your cause doesn't prevail, there will be more peace in the world than before. Go gently. And even if your cause doesn't prevail, there will be more peace in the world than before. It's called the Gentle Proposal. Those are 20 years old, those poems. They still ring true for me. So this idea of, the idea of trying to stop the war, job number one for me is stopping the war in here. That's the wisdom. That's the wisdom. War is happening up here, really. We got it wired in a way of fight or flight and all that stuff. And when you're attacked, it's very hard not to react with hatred and aggression and all that kind of stuff. Very hard. We all have our own wars going on in our workplace, in our families. It's just there's a lot of battlefields. That's why I said, go gently into your kitchens and into your living rooms. This idea of being gentle, and it leads us really to the meditation, essentially. I had the Dalai Lama and some of the music from his album because I've often talked about this old Tibetan that I had here who gave me the tapestry in the middle and the many things he told me in this, over tea. And one thing he said, Americans are sort of crazy, you're sort of warlike, you're blowing up people all over the world. And he said, but there's hope because we were like that. And I wasn't aware of that. We think of Tibetans and the Dalai Lamas, these guys are great people of peace. He says, no, we weren't like that originally. We were like warlike and we were feared. And the only reason we didn't have empires was because, we would swoop down on horses from Tibet. Tibet's size of Western Europe. Most people are amazed by that fact. So think Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, Poland, Italy. That's the size of, it's not some tiny little kingdom with a bunch of guys meditating. It's a huge plateau, and it's the highest place in the world. It's like 3 miles above sea level. So it's even a mile above most of India, and et cetera. And it just goes up and up. And so they would swoop down from there on horseback. These were horse people. And they took what they wanted. The Mongols, Genghis Khan, all these guys, they didn't want to mess with the Tibetans. The Tibetans showed up at their cities. They gave them what they wanted. They even went and sacked Beijing, and the Chinese gave them what they wanted. These guys were fierce. Well, what happened? Well, Buddhism came over the mountains, and it took a long time. The first time Buddhism came over the mountains, Buddhists thought they put them all to death because these guys were sort of shamanistic. They had these mountain gods who were pretty powerful, and they don't want to hear about this. But the second wave of Buddhism came over, and in about a couple hundred years, took about 300 years for them to be transformed. We haven't even been a country for 300 years, just around. And certainly, Buddhism has just said some from the 50s. So we've got a ways to go. They were horse people, and they knew how to tame horses because they had wild horses everywhere, but they would tame them. So think of your own mind. Think of your own mind. And so, they took a while to tame the mind, and you don't do it through aggression, through trying to root things out. I remember trying to get rid of anger. Oh, what folly. No, these guys were the original horse whisperers. They did it with kindness. And gradually, hundreds of years, they turned, they weren't raiding anymore. They were building monasteries to learn how to transform people, how to tame this dangerous, brilliant, but dangerous, aggressive mind, how to tame it and actually connect it with the heart. In the cave of the heart, there is no anger. You can bring anger in there and it will work on it and transform it. This is the place of transformation. And when you study Tibetan Buddhism, you see that. And it's also for Christianity. You see the heart all over the place in Christianity. So the original peace work is what we're about to do when we sit. And we drop our wars up here, we drop our aggression, we drop the whole shebang into the place of peace. And it's not easy, but you can learn how to do it. And over time, you can turn into a gentleman or a gentlewoman. You really can. I taught that one day in my 7th grade class. I said, all right, today's class, we're going to talk about being a gentleman or a gentlewoman. They all groaned. And I said, well, do you know where the word comes from? And they said, well, somebody said Emily Post. I was amazed they knew who Emily Post was. I said, no, it came from the Celtic tradition. Because they were sort of wild warrior types too. But you before they would give you a sword, you had to practice the art of dance and poetry and music. You had to go through these disciplines, sort of like, Mr. Miyagi, wax on, wax off. You had to do sort of this you had to practice things to sort of discipline yourself, to gentle yourself. And then they could put a sword or something in your hand, because then, you wouldn't be a danger to your own culture. I mean, think of all the military guys, that come back and, and just are wounded in many ways, but they know how to use weapons. One of my own 7th grade students, the day before he was set to deploy back to Afghanistan, he just went out in the garage and put his revolver in his mouth and ended it. And it was tragic. Bardstown kid married a girl he was in my class with. So she was left with that. So these are just things we got to work with. But we have all that potential in us, you see. We got to tame ourselves. We got to become gentlemen, gentlewomen. And this is one of the best ways to do it. So let's move to, if you move your position to do the sitting, we'll do our 20 minutes. We have these things to consider as we sit. Take a few breaths.